Welcome to the American Intelligence Media. I'm Douglas Gabriel. I'm your host today with Michael McKibben. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Thank you, Douglas. Glad to be here.
We are going to talk about the golden share. One of the most confusing things and one of the most fairy tale-ish conspiracies now proven by you and your investigators and your researchers, your miners, as Betsy calls you. You get down there in the mine and you get the gold. Well, in this case, you got the golden share, and it is shocking. It's so shocking that we were just chatting, trying to even grok, trying to understand really how there could be such a thing. And then you pointed out that, yeah, this happens in a number of situations. This just isn't the Queen of England.
Right. A golden share is just a level of shareholding that gives special rights to different classes of stock, and in this case, the class is one share held by the Crown. So that gives the power and control in those situations to the person who holds that share, which in the case of many British companies is the Crown. But that information is really hard to find. I will tell you that.
And you said that you can have the power and control, but not the dividends.
Right.
What is that about? And you even mentioned that you've seen other companies that do that.
Oh, yeah. It's called classes of stock. And I think most people who have never started a company or maybe only started one in their lives would never deal in this area. But all of our large companies have multiple classes of stock, A, B, C, D, E, F, and so on. And each level has a different set of voting rights associated with it. So in more sophisticated structures, you can even split the voting power or controlling power in a class from its right to participate in equity and dividends. So in theory, you could have one golden share at the top, using a hierarchical structure, one golden share at the top that has only voting rights and no dividend rights. And then all the dividends are distributed in lower classes of stock, but they don't control the company. The golden share would, which is the case with the Crown.
And this is Serco Awareness Month, as I'm sure you know. Instead of saying go Serco, we're going to say no Serco. And then you found the golden share in Serco, and that's connected to the atomic weapons establishment in England, and that's connected to Lockheed Martin, and then that's connected to the British National Fuel Limited, and then that's connected to a company called EIL, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, there's a golden share where we see that the Queen has somehow almost control over the three largest military industrial corporations in the world: Lockheed Martin, BAE USA, and BAE PLC. How is it that this can possibly be connected, that the Queen could be connected to Lockheed Martin, which does so much work for America, and she has this golden share, this ability to veto anything she wants, this power and control, and I can't help but think somehow I trust that the Queen's going to get her dividends.
Yeah, well, the trick is to read the details of each annual report of all these companies, because as is typical of these structures, they're convoluted, and they are meant to keep most people out of understanding what's going on. So I guess fortunately or unfortunately, I've read a lot of annual reports now and have started to see that all these reports are prepared by lawyers and accountants, and so between them they present a report which gets into the financial holdings, the assets, the liability, the balance sheet, the profit and loss statement, and they get into the beneficial ownership. In other words, they disclose who owns more than 5% of the shares in any company they're reporting on, and what the directors hold, what the chief officers hold. So there is a lot of detail in those reports. But the curious thing about describing the golden share in these reports is it's completely oblique, and if you weren't really looking for it, you could easily miss it. And what we've noticed is that the wording in all of these documents tends to be such that most people they would read right over it and not understand what they're reading. So that that's the first thing you got to realize when you look at these annual reports. Now, what was your question again?
Well, when the Queen has the golden share, didn't you say she can also
Yes.
give it out to somebody like the Secretary of Treasury or whoever, and then they have this amazing power?
The specific way that the golden share is just a name. It's not described as the golden share in any of these reports. It's usually called a special voting share or a special preference share, something to that effect. And there are several types of these mechanisms, depending on whether we're reading about a foundation, which in fact is the way the Crown agents are controlled, or we're reading about Serco, which on the surface is controlled by its chairman, Sir Roy Gardner, or its CEO, which is his last name is Soames, Rupert Soames, and he's got an OBE, an Order of the British Empire, and so those two gentlemen specifically take an oath of allegiance to the Crown as a part of their royal holdings. So you've got that mechanism control, but there's another mechanism of control specifically related to Serco and AWE, the Atomic Weapons Establishment in the UK, and Lockheed Martin, and that is the fact of who do they have their main contracts with. So let's just presume that you don't have the golden share, but you control 70% of a company's business. Don't you in fact have control of that organization? Wouldn't you think?
Yeah, you'd think.
Yeah. So anyway, the votes are one thing. Who gives them the business is another element. So as far as we can see now, we haven't dug into every subcategory of Serco yet because there are many. I'm going to guess 60 or 70 to sort through, which I hope we do this month with this team of researchers. But you have to start digging into each one of those and see where the real business is to see where the real power is in the situation. What we're finding is in each one of these, there have been clever mechanisms built in to make sure that either the company is controlled outright through the golden share, this special share, or it's controlled by the fact that the majority of the business that the organization has comes from Great Britain or the U.S. The case with AWE is really interesting because I think I've mentioned previously in talking to you, they've got a very confusing disclosure in the AWE annual report because it shows the golden share, which means the Crown holds the control, and yet in the back of and by the way, Lockheed UK is the third of 1/3 of the shares, along with Serco and the British Nuclear Fuels Limited. But in the back of the last page of the annual report for AWE, it says that the directors consider Lockheed Martin US as the controlling entity of AWE Limited in the UK.
Which is very confusing because the golden share has the veto power. So
Correct.
Though Lockheed may have power, they don't have controlling power because the Queen can veto anything.
Right. But you've got multiple entities in there that show the golden share. You've got not only Serco, but you've also got the British Nuclear Fuels Limited. So you've got 2/3 of the voting shares that are held in two golden shares in AWE. So that's 2/3 of the votes. And yet in an organization like that, you still have this disclosure that Lockheed Martin America runs the AWE network in Europe, in Britain.
And then I think it gets even more complicated when you try to ferret out what is part of the United Kingdom, what is part of the Queen's golden share, what is part of like the Atomic Weapons Establishment. I mean, that has to be controlled by UK, you would think. But then why does Lockheed Martin have somehow some control over that as a corporation? So all that I can see is obfuscation, seeming lying, and trickery to hide some things that we may still not have any idea are really going on. Now,
there's another key layer, by the way, that needs to be pointed out here, because we're talking about nuclear fuel, we're talking about aircraft, and we're talking about lots of craft in the world that need aluminum. In that there's another agency of the Crown called Rio Tinto that I'm not sure what the percentage is of the amount of mining resources in the world that the Queen holds, but it's significant. In Rio Tinto, the Queen also holds a golden share. So the Crown. So all or many of the mining and uranium rights that are used by these companies and the ore in the ground comes directly from Rio Tinto. So that's another golden share. So you got at least three golden shares in this scenario. And then you've got another company in the U.S. called Urenco that processes this nuclear fuel, this nuclear ore, and a third of that organization is controlled by a company with the golden share. So that golden share is spread out liberally throughout this network. And then when you layer on top of that the fact that between the British and the U.S., our military pretty much controls the contracts for this organization, you see pretty tight control.
These are turf wars for markets, and you're just describing the uranium market, which then bleeds into, as you pointed out, planes, missiles, weapons of war, nuclear facilities, all this crazy Uranium One battle with Putin. Really, there was a battle going on for 10 years that we now can see very clearly between, and this is just amazing, between Putin himself literally and Rosatom through Tenam and the Queen through Urenco. But the Queen might have won on that one because the Queen, as you pointed out, is one of the, literally, it's the UK. The UK owns our largest uranium enrichment plant along with Dutch National Holdings and German Holdings, two companies.
Correct.
So you get this idea that as we are using our old facility, uranium enrichment facility at Oak Ridge, and taking it uranium from a variety of sources with the Russians, and particularly through Uranium One, the sources that Hillary Clinton and CFIUS approved, and Jeff Sessions approved, and the whole gang in Washington approved, giving our uranium to Putin, and then using our facility to enrich it while he then enriches himself by selling it back to us. The same thing was happening with the Queen with Urenco, except that she really jacked us around. She said she'd build this facility for $1 billion. She got $1 billion into it, needed $2 more billion to finish it. Who paid for it? U.S. taxpayers. And then what happens? Her Rio Tinto uranium rights, she just digs them up and brings them across over to New Mexico, enriches them in a facility 2/3 paid for by taxpayers, gets the money, sells that to our uranium facilities in a war with Putin, in a turf war in America for our uranium. And so when we're talking about golden shares, it gets really sticky because I think golden share has so much to do with the crown, the Queen or the King, whoever, in Britain. And then, but you also see like a Putin who almost has a golden share in Rosatom.
Almost. I think it may be confusing to hear the term golden share because some people might think it has something to do with gold. I think that's just a name, quote, golden share. You don't see that written anywhere other than as a description of this super control that the Crown has over these companies. But you're right, in the Soviet Union, these oligarchs, or in the case of Putin, they certainly have, in effect, a golden share over their companies.
Well, you described that with the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, that there's a similar thing as they do in England. And so many of these systems we took from England because they're institutionalized ancient systems of control. And so we have not a golden share, but that, I forget what you call it, that transference to the Secretary of State to be the only person in charge of $50 billion. It's
the only shareholder in OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, is the Secretary of State of the U.S. And they say it's a private corporation, but it's got a .gov account, and it does FOIAs, and it acts like a government agency, but on paper it says it's a private account.
$80 billion under asset controls for a corporation that doesn't pay taxes, but we pay for it to run, $108 million a year we pay for OPIC to run. And then through this amazing thing you're describing, somehow that corporation is run by the Secretary of State.
Right.
And all they do is give money away, and they don't even keep track of who they give it to, practically. They have absolutely no compliance involved. And it's this cronyism of passing to anyone who wants to stand in line that happens to be a friend of the Secretary of State.
Well, the SES is the staffing for OPIC.
Absolutely.
So it's obviously cronyism. And the SES, who runs SES?
Yeah, and if that isn't good enough, the Secretary of State gets to give away another $50 billion, $50 billion a year, which is just astounding to think that the Secretary of State is set up in a position to do what Hillary Clinton did, which was pay for play. You want some weapons? Great. You give me some money to my foundation, I'll give you the weapons, or I'll give you some aid, or I'll give you a loan through OPIC, or through a big loan through USAID. Or how about if I look the other way for Uranium One and then you give me $145 million into my foundation? How about this happened to every country practically that she visited when she was Secretary of State. Some deal went down, she was enriched, and she gave away taxpayer money. Now, we were talking about the golden share controlling the largest corporations in the world. Lockheed is bigger than most nations and certainly more powerful. And now we find that the Queen is somehow deeply interwoven into our number one a military contractor in America, which is also our number one corporate intelligence group in America, which just was taken over by, merged with Leidos. We could talk about that all day long. But what you're talking about is, how is the Queen, why would the Queen in any way be involved in our military, or the company that has ripped us off for more than any other company in America? Lockheed Martin is responsible for trillions of dollars of rip-off of this country through the missing money from the Pentagon, just by sheer logical deduction. If the Pentagon is $9.5 trillion in the hole from contracts that they cannot follow with their bookkeeping, and Lockheed Martin has always been number one, number two of military contractors, then certainly they got some of that money. And James Comey worked for them to make sure that when they are charged with billion-dollar cost overruns or total fraud, they only pay small fees.
Well, I'm just being reminded of a short conversation I had with Professor Jim Chandler back in 2001, and he said to me, you can't think of the private contractors who supply the Department of Defense as anything but an extension of the U.S. government. Now I understand what he's talking about. It is an extension of the U.S. government. These quote private companies.
Well, that's what we're pointing out. In so much of the way that Serco came into existence, it was because one monopoly after the next, government-supported monopoly, transformed so that it wouldn't look like it was a monopoly. And in the end, the monopoly goes to the Queen through Serco. It's like, what?
Right.
How did that happen? Because it's a monopoly. They know that it's happening. It's like Standard Oil. It's like any of these Silicon Valley, they act as if they're monopolies, Google, Facebook, Twitter. These are government-supported monopolies, right. And the golden share is nothing more than a corporate way, a legal way, to make sure that you can hide what's really going on.
Well, you can hide any activity that's unconstitutional from our Constitution by shifting it to the European or British side of the operation. So there's this, it's apparent, there's this fluid activity between these various entities that cross national borders and allow them to do whatever they want. They set their own rules. They staff their own companies. They provide funds. Whenever they need outside funds, they get some more from the U.S. taxpayers. That keeps it flowing. It's pretty apparent what's going on now. And so now I'm beginning to understand why these people are so darned arrogant, because they know they run the situation. And President Trump came in and looks to upset what they have built for the last, 150 years.
Oh, absolutely. They have it sewn up. And I'm always harping upon corporate intelligence that serves the military and the federal government. But equally as powerful is the corporate intelligence that serves industrial espionage.
Right.
And that's what we're talking about here, is this is legalized industrial espionage that sells out entire nations because of agreements called Five Eyes. The Brits aren't my friend. I don't know who, maybe they're your friend. They're not my friend because Christopher Steele was a Brit. He created the Trump dossier. Every time, guess who it was that was actually surveilling Trump? Oh, that was the Brits, the British intelligence agency working directly out of Fort Meade, Maryland. Who is it that actually spies on people in the Congress? Oh, that would be the Israeli Mossad. That would be, these are agreements that we have with intelligence agencies, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Israel, Britain. I don't trust any of them. I don't want any of them involved in anything to do with informing our president about intelligence, like the good intelligence that came from France and Britain about the gas attack in Syria. Well, we knew there was no gas attack, but when these people put their entire intelligence community on the line and says, no, we will swear, here's the proof, what are you going to do when you're the president? Say, no, you're all liars? He already said that to the intelligence community. He said, I don't want any of your intelligence reports from the beginning. I don't even know if he receives any now. The point is he had his own intelligence, and that is called industrial intelligence. They can call it espionage, but Krul and other groups like that, they rule the world through economics, and what you're describing are the legal mechanisms of hiding those control valves, those linchpins, those golden shares, the golden key that opens the magic box for just the right person. And it's really disturbing, but in all of this, once you see how simple it is, you can see how easy it would be to pull the plug.